social media. I am your hostess, the Cinegeek, and today I would like to give you a brief history of the movie rating system and how it's kind of morphed and changed through the years and how that has affected the landscape of cinema. So we kind of start back in 1922 with the MPDAA, which is the Motion Picture Distributor of Association of America. And then they produced something called the Hays Code, or it was actually the Motion Production Code, in 1934. In 1968, the MPDAA was renamed to the MPAA, which is what we have today, and that is the Motion Picture Association of America. And in that same year, they created a rating system which is going to be G, PG, R, and X. And then in 1984, they created PG-13, and in 1990, they renamed X to NC-17, and I'll kind of get more into that later, but on the other side, you can kind of see what each of these ratings stand for, and I gave, for G and PG, I gave examples of kind of what the difference between those movies might be, because some people are a little confused. G are most Pixar films, and there's really nothing in them that would require any kind of parental guidance. They're all fine. So back in the early days of Tinseltown, or Hollywood as you might call it, film industry operated under pre-code. And that was really no kind of rating system, although it should be noted between 1915 and 1952, the Supreme Court had actually ruled that free speech did not extend to film. So there were a few years during the pre-code era even where filmmakers couldn't go and do anything on film, but back then they could do a lot more than they could during the Hays Code. And at that point, films were a little bit more risque. You saw a lot of men kind of dressing in a lot of costumes, which during the Hays Code's time, you did not. And you could see men and women engaged in more like LGBTQ kind of relationships, and you could see like cross-dressing, and obviously back in the early days of the pre-code, it was silent era of film, so you didn't really have much of conversation, but you could get away with a lot more visually than you could during the Hays Code era. But all good things, of course, unfortunately come to an end, and there were a couple really big scandals in Hollywood, such as the death of William Desmond Taylor, and the man, he was a big comedian at the time named Fatty Arbuckle, and he was accused of raping a young lady. And although not as prominent, but still really important to the creation of the code, was the unfortunate death of the Latin lover, Rudolph Valentino. So this man, William Hays, who was, I believe, a minister, created what was known as the Hays Code, and like I said, it was actually called the Motion Picture Production Code. And this was created, or adopted in like 1930, and here's kind of a brief synopsis of all the rules. So crimes against the law, there are really specific rules in how you can show how crimes are committed. For instance, you cannot depict criminals as sympathetic characters, and you cannot show it in a light that would cause people or inspire people to imitate the crime. How the crime is shown is limited, meaning you can't show them specifically how they're doing it, because then it could show people how to get away with committing said crime. No brutal killings or revenge killings can be depicted. No drug trafficking can be depicted. And at that time, no alcohol can be depicted, because this is kind of overlaps with prohibition. So obviously there are, of course, very stringent rules regarding sex. So they have to uphold the sanctity of marriage. Like in TV, how back in the olden times, oftentimes married couples would sleep in different beds. Same rule applied. They couldn't show adultery, they couldn't depict scenes of passion, even silhouetted. They could only imply them. They couldn't show seduction or rape, sexual perversion, meaning LGBTQ characters, white slavery, or miscegenation, which is couples of different races. So you couldn't have, a white man or woman with a black man or woman. Obviously, in this particular case of opposite sex. And you couldn't show childbirth. Well, I kind of agree with that one. And then one today, again, that I also definitely agree with, and it's still a rule, you can't show children in the nude. And then lastly, they couldn't depict STDs, which is weird. Dance, specifically, they couldn't depict like dance that emphasized indecency. So I guess they were going with a Footloose kind of thing. Titles couldn't be inappropriate. They had to have them national feels, like respect the flag. But oddly enough, in this I kind of like they had to respect the history and people of other nations and show them fairly. So they couldn't be overtly racist, although back in those times they were doing blackface, so I don't really know how that worked out. Religion couldn't be ridiculed, but this was any religion, so like even, Hinduism or anything like that couldn't be depicted negatively, as well as Christianity. Ministers couldn't be shown as villains, and they couldn't be the comedic character. And they must respect ceremonies. Back in the day, generally, if there were a couple getting married, you might have the beginning of "We, dearly beloved, we're gathered here today," and then generally you're gonna get like a hard cut to them walking out of the church and everyone throwing like rice or whatever at them. They couldn't have profanity, obscenity, vulgarity, and then like repelling acts such as hanging or electrocution as forms of legal execution. They couldn't have branding people or animals, surgical operations. I like that one. Children or animal abuse, which I also kind of like, but I mean, obviously there are movies about that, and they couldn't depict brutality. And that kind of sums up the Hays Code. So, like I said, in 1968, the MPAA became the MPAA, and we still have that today. And they put in place the rating system, which is very similar to the one that we still have. It hasn't really changed that much. So we get G, which is general admittance, and there's no warnings attached to it. PG, which was originally named M, and then changed to GP until finally they landed on PG, which is for parental guidance. And this rating is meant for, it's children, but there's a mild warning attached to it. Then you get R, which is restricted, meaning no one under 17 is admitted without an adult. So if you're 18 or over, you can get in without an adult. If you're 17 or under, you have to have an adult with you to gain access to the theater. And last we have NC-17, which was originally titled X and changed to NC-17 in 1990, I believe because of Stanley Kubrick. He had a movie come out, I want to say it was Eyes Wide Shut, but I actually don't recall. And X had such a association with pornography, he was really angry and didn't want, his film. I don't know if it was Eyes Wide Shut, but it would be funny if it is, because that is the most pornographic movie with a wide opening ever. But he didn't want that connotation of X attached to it, so he really fought hard to get X reading to NC-17 rather than cutting out a few scenes and having it just have an R rating. But with NC-17, you have to be 18 or older to get into the theater. So if you're 17, even if you have an adult, you cannot go into the theater, which is why NATO, the National Association of Theater Owners, generally don't pick up movies with that film rating because they're not money makers. And lastly, that brings us to, in 1984, the adaptation of PG-13, and that is because Spielberg produced Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom and Gremlins, and parents were pissed because that was PG, and they took their kids to see a movie that was, like, graphic, with raiders, like, people's faces melted. In Temple of Doom, the guy got his heart ripped out, Kali Ma style. And then in Gremlins, they have these little green monsters that go going around murdering people, although I think that old lady deserved it. If you want to kill a dog, I don't feel bad for you. I'm just saying maybe she had her comeuppance. And that is the entirety of the rating system. And then if you stay tuned, I have a ridiculous rant about how Steven Spielberg has basically ruined film. So in all honesty, I really love Steven Spielberg. But in being so successful, he's kind of damaged cinema. Of course, one of the highest grossing films of all time, adjusted for inflation, is Jaws. Jaws was absolutely the first summer blockbuster. And look how many summer blockbusters now we get every single year. Marvel is cannibalizing itself to a ridiculous rate. Captain Marvel and Avengers Endgame, I think, come out a little over a month, like a month and a half apart from each other. That's absolutely ridiculous. I don't think they have faith in Captain Marvel, which makes me sad because I do. I just want a good female superhero movie. Anyway, so a lot of times now people go out and purposely make these big IP, which is intellectual property, films, these movies they know are going to be summer blockbusters. And at this point now we're also getting like movies specifically geared that would have been summer blockbusters, but because there's so many summer blockbusters, they put them out specifically during Christmas, because that's when obviously people have a lot of time off work and they want to go to the movie and spend time with family and stuff like that. So he kind of killed cinema in that way. Also, of course, since we're talking about the movie rating system, we have to talk about PG-13, which was kind of created because of a couple of films he produced, and specifically because he recommended it. And I don't understand why so many movies are PG-13. Movies that really obviously shouldn't have been 13, specifically like Venom, for instance, totally should have been R. And there are a lot of horror movies that are PG-13 that, I mean, why would you make that movie PG-13? This should have been an R. And back in the day, when home release was a lot more viable of an option, like a lot more people bought DVDs and Blu-rays and stuff, I didn't mind as much because you knew that they were going to release like the R or the unrated version, which would be the R version, when you bought it, and it would have like some, like the things that they had to cut to get it to be R or more likely PG-13. But honestly, having things rated down like that doesn't really make sense. You might think, well, they want more of an audience to go. And that's true. You do want as wide of an audience as possible, but aren't you kind of alienating some of your adult audience? Because I certainly sometimes feel kind of alienated when a movie seems like it should definitely be R and it's PG-13. And, you know, movies like Deadpool have illustrated that our movies can do well. It has illustrated our movies can do well. So why break it down to PG-13 when you see our movies can be successful? And so I looked up, this was for the year 2016 to be transparent, so I'm a year behind. But it's the MPAA's statistical report for the year 2016. And yes, I did a lot of research. And I found that of the age cohort combining the 2 to 17-year-olds, they made up only a quarter of moviegoers and tickets sold. So for 23 to 25% of your audience might not participate in the film. Might. There are still parents who will take their kids to see our movies. I worked at a theater for 3 years. I guarantee you I sold tickets to teenagers and even little children going to see our movies with their families. It definitely happens. And some people are totally fine with that. But also, when 75% of your audience can go and see a movie without having to have it restricted, and you purposely make it a lesser film to sell more tickets, that's problematic. And honestly, I don't think Steven Spielberg would like that. He intrinsically looks at the value, I hope, of the film. I'd like to think so. I think he really cares. I mean, I think from the films that he's made, he really cares about film. And he cares about the idea of film and the artistry of film. And I don't think he would like to see movies just being made solely based on their marketing value, which is what it's been reduced to. Which is so sad for me, because they should be art. And you shouldn't look at what a 14-year-old says and let that dictate what the movie is going to be. Side note, for those of you who don't know, you can be 10, 11, 9, 8 and go and buy a ticket for a PG-13 movie. You don't actually have to be 13. I noticed, when I did work at a theater, I noticed a lot of people had a lot of confusion regarding that. It is PG-13, but it's not restricted to you have to be 13 or older. But it's so bothersome that, again, only a quarter of your audience may or may not be unable to go. And you might get more of an audience if people say, hey, this filmmaker obviously had the ability to make the movie they wanted to because it's R. And that's what R communicates to people now. And that isn't what it used to be. And I think that's so unfortunate. Sad. It's sad that R means that the producers let them do what they wanted. And that shouldn't be the case. And lastly, I will say, you know, as an adult who can see an R-rated film, sometimes it's nice to see an R-rated film. It doesn't have to be just gory, like torture porn filled with 17 F-bombs, although that was a fantastic scene Steve Martin nailed. And it's fine to have an R-rated film. There are fantastic R-rated movies, as the one I just referenced, Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, because they had 17 F-bombs inside of a minute. It made it R. That's perfectly suitable for even children, and certainly for an adult. And I don't think that it's bad to have a scene like that. Like, it's totally fine. R doesn't mean bad. And I really wish studios would take a step back and realize 14-year-olds don't speak for 75% of the rest of the moviegoers. Anyway, I've been the Cine Geek. Thank you so much for listening, and have a fantastic movie. Have a fantastic movie. I'll leave it at that. Bye.